Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay the elders respect to the elders past, present, and future. It's also my pleasure to introduce Riccardo Fusaroli, who comes to us all the way from Denmark. So I was saying, oh, it's a bit cold right now. And it's like, no. But it's really quite a special treat to have him here. He's an associate professor in cognitive science at Aarhus University in Denmark. And well, we'll see a lot about his research focus, but just to sort of whet your appetite, Riccardo's really interested in studying coordination and communicative interactions, and I guess coordination more generally, and efficacy. And what's really quite nice about Riccardo's work is he brings together a whole lot of different disparate disciplines. So we've got cognitive science, semiotics. There's also developmental psych, linguistics, all sorts of things in here. I don't know if they'll all be piled into this one talk.
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
I've had 3 coffees, so yes, I'm gonna pile everything in.
But yeah, so we're in for quite a treat. Thank you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been following actually Andy's work for many years on Twitter, mostly, and papers. So I'm very excited to be speaking here. I'm going to be speaking about the development of turn-taking in child-caregiver interactions. And I want to foreground that a lot of this work has been done with Chris Cox, who's there at the start of his PhD, now is, more bearded and wary of life, but he's going to start his postdoc soon with me again. We can do these sort of things in Denmark. It's great. But before we get into the flash, I had actually prepared also welcome to country, which I'm not going to read because I cannot yet pronounce the names, but I just want to say that it's been a real treat to explore the traditions as showcased at Marble Museum, at the Marble Marble restaurant, and at the NGV Australia. And this whole idea of song lines and embodied knowledge is something that I really want to explore more. So that was exciting. But who I am, that's me. My kids are slightly older now, but really when I'm at home, that's generally the kind of setup that we have. I was trained in pure humanities many years ago in Bologna. I was studying semiotics, as Andy mentioned, which is the study of how things make sense, mostly to human. And it was a fantastic 5 years because we would go from deep theory on American pragmatism, medieval philosophy of language, and what have you, to trying to figure out how movies made sense and literature and wine, and highly recommend it. But this really led me a deep interest for how we make sense together. And I think it's one of the crucial questions for a lot of disciplines, maybe not always acknowledged, but even cognition is in many ways, human cognition, a joint meaning-making process. So now I identify as a cognitive scientist. I mostly spend my time doing computational and statistical models on empirical, sometimes even experimental data, which is very different from what I used to do. But I still have this idea that cognition, the way we make decisions, the way we perceive the world, is a collective, in many ways, infused activity, and conversations are prime examples of how we do things together. And that's why I'm going to be talking about conversations. Also, I cannot help by using my humanities hat and say, as we study, whatever we study, we're enacting scientific practices, which are collective meaning making, in which we create knowledge according to established practices. And we should always throw a light on the way that we are building knowledge, because that will show us a lot of blind spots and a lot of strength as well. And I hope that this is going to shine through these very meta talk that I'm going to give today. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to do a brief cap on why turn-taking is interesting. I think I don't need to oversell it here, but we're going to have a cute video. I'm then gonna be talking about a systematic review and meta-analysis of vocal turn-taking in child-caregiver interactions, because as for everything I study, I never know what I'm getting into. So I tend to corrupt the youth and involve my students in doing these systematic reviews. Also want to note that vocal is what we focus on because it's easy, but it's by no means the only part of turn-taking. Noddings, back channels, movements are very important. We just need to start somewhere. After presenting the systematic review and meta-analysis, I'm going to be showing how we can learn the lesson from these work in two parallel studies that just last night I combined in a very different way than what I had thought. I hope it's going to work. But one is a longitudinal study in 2 to 5 year olds where we're following them for 2 years. And the other one is a 7-week, 7-session study on 10-year-olds on average. Half of the children are autistic, half of the children are typically developing children. Again, a note about language. I know that some parents prefer children with autism, identify person first. Others prefer autistic children. I'm not taking a stance by saying autistic children. It's just a convenient way of speaking about that in this case, which offends the least amount of people. If the time allows, I'm then going to conclude with a note on mechanistic futures, where I'm going to be talking about how we can cross-pollinate the study of human animal turn-taking with the study of non-human animal turn-taking, because, again, the scientific practices when studying non-humans are very different from those when studying humans. Good. Why turn-taking? I'm sure you've all seen these videos, but if not, here is... Maybe. Yes. And they're clearly speaking Italian, right? Okay, so why am I showing this video? Well, we have 2 toddlers that for the purpose of the video at least are pre-verbal. They're not using language as we are used to use it, but they are having a very engaged conversation. They are very skillfully alternating in who's producing sounds and even like pressing their foot. Sometimes they're punctuating in very skillful way the conversation with joint vocalizations, right? And these really highlights how the temporal organization of our communicative exchanges is a very basic mechanism that is associated to our ability to use language in social context, perhaps, or even in making joint actions, and so on and so forth. And so, indeed, turn-taking has been argued to be foundational to a lot of aspects of our interactions, from the ability to effectively transfer information, because if 3 of us are speaking all 3 at the same time, it's going to be very hard to process what the others are doing and respond in a prompt way to what they're doing, even if my kids try to keep at least 3 people speaking at the same time. But also, turn-taking is very connected to the way that we share emotions and we share rapport. There is a really beautiful study by Emma Templeton that came out last year, in which she shows that as people engage in conversations with strangers and friends, the more smooth the transition is, meaning when you have a short gap or a short overlap, the better the rapport experienced by the interlocutors as rated by them, but also as rated by third-party raters. This is shown to be quite widespread across cultures. There's 2 studies by Stivers and by Dingemanze that have analyzed over 20 different languages from more than 10 different language families, showing that the average timing that it takes to respond to your interlocutor's utterance is, according to Stivers, 250 milliseconds if you focus on question answers, according to Dingemanze, 59 milliseconds if you focus on all sort of speech acts in conversation, which is the kind of reaction times that we would exclude from our analysis if we were running a cognitive science experiment in the lab. Yet the average response latency is that fast, right? Nevertheless, engaging in conversation is challenging, right? Especially if you engage in conversation in your 2nd, 3rd, 4th language, you'll notice it very evidently. It requires processing what's going on in the other person, language, tone, gestures, movements. It requires planning what you're going to say, predicting when you're going to jump in, but also sort of second guessing yourself what the other person is going to do according to what I'm going to say, the way I'm going to say, the way I'm going to move, and so on and so forth. It's really challenging cognitively. So the question that I'm trying to ask in this talk is, how do children manage? So let's see what the wise people in the field have figured out. So with two interns from Ghent University, Vivian Guyen, Otto Versip, and with my, at the time, PhD student, Chris Cox, we did a systematic review and meta-analysis. We identified 266 papers in the literature that we read, out of which 26 contained empirical estimates of the timing that children have in responding to their parents. I could talk about this plot forever, but basically we can see that there's, in terms of who's citing who, three different traditions in the field. People are not really talking to each other, and that all of the studies are in the US or Europe, nothing else, everywhere else. So whatever I'm going to say, take it with a big grain of salt, right? So what did we learn from reading all those papers? Well, the idea is that turn-taking abilities seem to imply a set of different sort of abilities that develop gradually in the children. According to the most prominent hypothesis in the field, the interactive engine hypothesis by Steve Levinson, human children, are endowed with our uniquely human sociocognitive skills. That is our ability to infer other people's mental states, to predict their behavior in the future, and so on and so forth, which enable very young infants up to a week from birth to engage in very smooth, adult, fast interactions in terms of right? As the children have to process and produce more complex linguistic abilities, their turn taking is supposed to slow down until they reach linguistic mastery of the level where they are, at which point they're gonna speed up. And according to the paper that you read, that period in the children is gonna vary widely according to the result of your study. 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, who knows, right? The second line of research is more inactive in a sense. It says that the more children are able to engage the word with their body, the better they are at perceiving these rhythmic affordances and the better they are at promptly engaging. This is by Jana Iverson and a few other people. Finally, while these approaches are kind of the better you are at X, the faster you are at taking turns, there is an alternative orthogonal hypothesis, that's the interpersonal adaptation by Wilson and Wilson, that says that actually we also need to adjust to whatever the other is doing. So if I'm driving the car, and since I don't have a car, I don't drive very often, there's a bit of a traffic spot, and I'm getting very nervous, and my conversation with my kid is going to slow down. They're going to be skillful conversationalists if they also slow down with me. So the ability to adjust to the other tempo is going to be very important. Okay, this is the theory. We can then go and look at the estimates and say, what does the estimate tell us about these theories? And I don't know if you've ever done any meta-analysis, the results are always very dissatisfying. There's very rich theories out there and very little in terms of estimates available, but we can look at development. Do children actually slow down and speed up? Well, here you can see on the x-axis, infant age in months. On the y-axis, the infant response latency in milliseconds. Each of the dots is one estimate. Usually it's actually an aggregated across children. The bigger it is, the more confident the estimate it is, that is the bigger the sample size and or the less heterogeneous the behavior of the children in that group. And here I fitted a quadratic curve just to sort of make the case that this would be the hypothesis, but I hope that you would all agree with me that it's a terrible fit. And that really what's going on is that children are, according to the meta-analytic evidence, not changing in their average response latency over time. And given that there are crazy studies out there saying that children take about 3 seconds on average to respond. Have you ever been in a conversation, right? Then the meta-analytic average is about 1 second for the children. There is really no fine-grained testing of the different individual skills, but we can see that there's a few studies on autistic children that are atypically developing in both motor, sociocognitive, and linguistic skills. And for autistic children, there is a finding that children are on average 1.3 seconds delayed when responding an utterance, which is reliably slower than the typically developing children. Then the biggest finding of the meta-analysis is that if we look at adaptation, again, these are aggregated estimates, all the adults in that study, all the children in that study, but we see a very strong correlation between children and adults. The slower the child, the slower the adult, and vice versa. Again, who has that sort of conversations? Good. So if then we try to draw some conclusions, again, if you've ever done any systematic review or meta-analysis, you get more questions than answers, and that's the fun of science, right? So are children really that slow? My children's aren't. So 1 second is crazy. So we went and looked back at the methods, and we realized that actually what a lot of the studies are doing, for various reasons, more or less legitimate, is that they conceptualize overlappings as either failed turn taking. Overlapping is when you start speaking before I'm done, or as something qualitatively different to be analyzed separately, so they truncate the distribution. Second, any conversation, especially with the child, will have occasionally very long response latencies. 8 seconds, 12 seconds, 20 seconds, because the child is doing something else, right? Or you ask a cognitively challenging question and they have to think about that. And all the studies are using Gaussian likelihoods, meaning they're assuming that there is a mean and a standard deviation, which is symmetric on both sides, meaning that even a few 8 seconds latencies are going to move drastically the mean. And this is the kind of distribution that instead turn-taking is in child-caregiver interactions. You can see that below 0, so response latencies on the x-axis, the frequency at which they happen on the y-axis. Below 0, there's according to the study, 25 to 40% of the turns start before the other is done. And you can see in the gray vertical line, it's about 1 second. A substantial chunk of the response latencies are above 1 second. So we might need to do better. Second, should we trust the data about temporal development? Well, we're only looking at cross-sectional data, and we're looking at aggregates across children. And anybody who has ever seen a children, even just on TV, knows that children are very different in the way they develop from each other, right? Also, is really development best operationalized as age, right? So the theories are bringing in specific cognitive, linguistic, and motor abilities, but no test. We need to do better. Also, already it's bad to aggregate across children, but why should we aggregate data across a whole conversation? Not all latencies are born equal, right? So sometimes I'm saying something that my child knows very well. Sometimes I'm communicating very novel information. That should be taken into account for. What about whether they're interacting with a very familiar caregiver at school or the very annoying colleague from your dad who's just asking you weird stuff that you don't know the answer to, right? That's going to be very different in terms of latency. And ideally, right, individual differences will modulate your ability to answer these different contexts. If you're linguistically very gifted, right, a very challenging utterance might not be as problematic. If you're socially very smooth, the rando co-worker of your dad is not going to be too problematic, right? So we need to sort of start taking these into account to make sense of turn taking. Also, we've seen that adaptation is the biggest result in the meta-analysis, but here, just for the fun of it, I made 4 causal diagrams of what might be causing these apparent correlation between child and adults. For instance, we might have that the child age, their level of development is determining how fast the child can respond. and the parent adjust to the general level of the child as perceived in the longer period. Or it could be that the child age determines the child response latency, and the parent is responding on a turn-by-turn level. Or it could be that it's determining the adult who knows or thinks to know where the child is, adjust the response latency accordingly, and the child is just following. Right? There is no way of discriminating these hypotheses from the aggregated data. So this is where I always find these pyramids of evidence very hilarious when meta-analyses are on top, because meta-analyses are not maps of the evidence out there. They're actually maps for the next step of the research. They're telling you which questions you should ask. And now I'm going to present 2 follow-up studies in which we try to learn from these lessons. Okay, so we have the Yukon study, amazing data set collected by Letitia Nagels and Deborah Fain at University of Connecticut. For the purpose of these analyses, we're going to analyze 64 infant caregiver diets. 32 of the children are autistic. The 2 groups are linguistically matched, so they're not matched in terms of age, but we start testing them in the earliest one at 18 months, and we stop at 62 months. We have 6 visits per child every 4th month, and we have a play session at home with the same box of toys for all the children, for all the ages, to the point that the older kids are just, seriously, dude? Right? What is this stuff? They're de facto affiliative conversation, a very familiar setup with a very familiar caregiver. The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia / Rush study has 28 autistic children, 12 girls, 20 typically developing children, 12 girls, 10 years of age on average. They were, well, our idea was to have 1 phone conversation 1 week, 1 in-person visit the next week, and so on. But COVID, so 7 sessions on the phone in consecutive weeks. 3 different contexts. A matching game with caregivers where they had to position stickers on a specific board, but basically it's a task-oriented game with a familiar interlocutor, and affiliative conversation with both, but separately, and previously unfamiliar research assistant and the very same caregiver. You can see the 2 studies are not the same, but they allow us to explore different aspects of the questions we've been pointing to. The first corpus has more than 150,000 conversational turns. The CHOP-ROSH more than 100,000. More stuff there. I can share the slides after, so that's just the detailed description of the corpora in papers. So questions we can tackle with the data. What are the developmental trajectory, right, in terms of age and autism of response latency? For age, it's obviously only the Yukon corpus. For autism, both. How do turn-taking characteristics depend on social, cognitive, linguistic, and motor development? In both studies, we have rich metadata of all of this. What is the role of turn-by-turn adjustment? We can look at the role of context, the different conversations, but also linguistic predictability. So the distance in terms of contextual semantic embeddings from utterance to utterance in the CHOP-ROSH corpus, and in terms of what the adult is doing in the previous turns in both of the studies. In terms of methods, ask me questions later, but basically we are using directed acyclical graphs, so those sort of causal diagrams to drive multi-level Gaussian Bayesian regression models. So what are the developmental trajectories of response latencies? We can see that in the literature, this is what people have been doing. They've analyzed response latency as a function of autism, really diagnosis more than autism per se, and age. We're going to analyze that, but then we're going to open up the Pandora's box of social cognitive development, motor development, and linguistic development. And I'm using these DAGs here as intuitive support to show the different theories, but actually we use them also to determine if we want to look at the specific effect of sociocognitive development on response latency, what should we adjust for? Assuming that these are the only factors involved. Big assumption. Okay. So here is what we see when we analyze the UCOD corpus. We can see first and foremost that the response latency is much faster than what the literature tells us. On average, across the two groups, it's about 300 milliseconds, which is very close to adults in the Stivers et al. Study. We also see that children get faster over time, on average, all of them. But surprisingly, compared to the literature, we see that the autistic children are much faster than the typically developing children. This is more than 100 milliseconds, which is huge in conversations. It gets even bigger later on. Right? Well, what if we try to reproduce the analysis that previous studies have done? So we remove the overlappings and we don't account for the long tail on the right. And the model has some issues converging because we're violating lots of assumptions, so take it with a grain of salt. But suddenly, the average response latency jumps up to 1.5 seconds. It's really overlapping between the two groups. But if you're really stuck with this idea that autistic individuals are slower, well, there's a 40 milliseconds reliable difference at the start. 40 milliseconds is big in conversation, but it disappears very fast. What's happening here? Well, clearly what's happening is that we have more overlappings in the children with autism, where overlappings might mean very many different things. All the reviewers that rejected this paper think that they're interruptions. If you go and look at the videos, they're not interruptions, right? So we do lots of things together. We laugh together. We complete each other's sentence. I might get bored by what Vanessa is saying because I heard this story already, and we're gonna sort of jump in to contribute a novel piece of information. And that's actually, if we have the right kind of report, is a positive thing. So it might be that indeed the autistic children are interrupting more. They're not as engaged with the content, they just jump in. It might be that as utterance becomes more and more predictable, and we can show that in your typical adult conversations, the interlocutor tends to jump in. And the predictability we can show in your typical adult conversation then goes back to 0, and then it keeps rising again. It might be that autistic children have a lower threshold for predictability. They're just jumping in earlier. But it might also be that it's not due to the autistic children alone that there is a difference. It might be that parents are producing more scaffolding interactions. They might have more predictable utterances, which justifies the jumping in earlier, seemingly. Or it might be that since all of these families are undergoing ABA interventions, they know that they need to show good examples of a well-functioning social interaction, which means that while the parents of typically developing children stop speaking when the child jumps in, the parents of autistic children are sort of finishing the turn very emphatically, right? So these are all things that we can only figure out by qualitative coding. It's not my favorite part, qualitative coding, but it is super important. Okay, does this generalize to the other corpus? Here we can see the 3 contexts: matching game, familiar interlocutor, affiliative conversation, familiar interlocutor, affiliative conversation, unfamiliar interlocutor, autistic in red, and the typically developing in blue. And we can see that these difference with typically developing children being slower is replicated across, generalized, I prefer to say, because these are different subpopulation. It's generalized across the 3 contexts. What about if we remove the overlappings and the long tail? Actually, surprisingly enough, we see that the difference is smaller, but persists in the task-oriented game with a familiar interlocutor, in the affiliative conversation with the unfamiliar interlocutor, and it only disappears in the context that is most similar to the UConn study, the familiar affiliative conversation. where we might imagine, right, that overlappings are really disjoint engagement that are very affiliative, right? Okay, so are autistic faster in these specific corpus? Yes, it generalizes. And well, I've said that removing overlap removes the effect only in the same context. What about individual differences? Well, we can see here on the x-axis, you have the months from first visit. On the y-axis, you have the average child response latency. And here we're creating counterfactual children because unfortunately, children have the bad habit of having correlations between their levels of development in different skills. So what we're doing here is we fit the model on the real data, and then we simulate children that keep all the other cognitive abilities constant except the one that we're visualizing. So the yellow one is the top one, is the simulated children that have one standard deviation above average in socialization skills. And surprisingly enough, we see that the higher your socialization skill, no matter your age, the slower you are. Keep that in mind because I'm going to explain it in a second. But first, let's look at linguistic skills. Keeping everything else constant, linguistic skills don't seem to matter for the typically developing children on the right. The three lines are overlaying. On the left, for the autistic children, the higher yellow your linguistic skills, the faster you are. This makes more sense. Right? Motor skills, same picture, except now it's across groups. The better you are in motor skills, everything else kept at average, the faster you are at responding. What's going on with socialization? When we go and dig deeper into the data, and what's going on is that the better your social skills, the narrower your variance in responding, meaning that you're reducing both the gaps, the positive response latencies, but also the overlappings. And the combined effect is that you seem slower. So if we remove the overlapping, again, the models have a lot of problems working, but if we take them at face value, it flips. Okay, here is a terrible plot. I was trying to redo it last night. I didn't manage, but I'm just gonna talk through it. Basically, if we try in the chop rush corpus to replicate the fact that the higher the linguistic skills, the lower the response latency, we don't find anything. If we look at the finding that the higher the motor skills, the lower the response latency, if you're really, really keen, you can see a slight asymmetry where there is that relation, but it's really weak. I wouldn't put any money on that. If we look at the social cognitive skills, and here we were using the SRS questionnaire, which split social cognition in many dimensions. So we have social cognition, that is the more traditional theory of mind kind of things, social awareness and social motivation. What we find is that for social awareness, the higher the social awareness, the slower your response latency. And again, we replicate the idea of the variance shrinking. But they're also slow in the gaps. So you're second guessing yourself, maybe, I don't know. The higher the social cognition, the faster your response latency. And social motivation is a bit of a mess. There seems to be an interaction, but the estimates are very uncertain. Again, don't put any faith in that. And these effects are really are in all three contexts, but where they become very strong and visible and statistically reliable without any squinting is the unfamiliar context, right? Speaking with an unfamiliar interlocutor really has your individual differences making a difference. Last part, adaptation. Here, it's the same tag as before, but we add the fact that your own previous latency and the other previous latencies are impacting where you are. Why are we putting both? Because let's say that I'm speaking slower and Vanessa speaks slower adjusting to me, and I keep speaking slower. Right? You might think that I'm adjusting to Vanessa, but we want actually to regress out where I'm going already. And that's where we have both of them. For the nerds, these are again direct acyclical graph-driven structural difference equations. In particular, in the literature, they're being called dyadic coupling by some people, actor-partner interdependence models by other people. We read the literature, we saw they were very nuanced and blah, so we rebuilt our own instead. Okay, what we see in the UConn corpus is that no matter whether you're an autistic child or a typically developing child, you adjust to the other on a turn-by-turn basis, even after controlling for your own previous turn. And the same for your own latency, right? Which I'm not going to go into the details of that, but basically it means that you're going to have these waves in which the conversation enters a faster bout of about 3 to 9 turns, and then it goes into a slower bout. Your question there.
Is there a reason that this seems like to be different?
Yes, it's well, actually, we didn't need to do that, but it's because excursion has an exponential tail, which is on a log scale, and so we weren't particularly careful in making predictions that would stick to only 1 second. It's just because on a log scale, things get very big very fast. No, this is predictions of the model. So we're just doing a counterfactual. We're saying if we keep everything else fixed at average and we have all these possible previous latencies, what's the predicted latency of the child? Yes, they're not raw data. I have the raw data. They're in the paper, but this is cleaner for the talk. Yes. If we look at the brush chop corpus and we focus only on the interpersonal adjustment, we can see that in the task-oriented familiar interlocutor, again, same pattern. It's not exactly the same between the two groups, but we get that the faster your interlocutor, the faster you are. In the familiar interlocutor affiliative conversation, the difference between the two groups gets bigger, but still they're both reliably positive. When we go to the unfamiliar interlocutor, everything is flat. We actually replicated that with adults in the Templeton paper I was telling before. We reanalyzed the data, and we see that even neurotypical adults speaking with a familiar interlocutor adjust, speaking with a stranger, they don't adjust. What about content? And this is, and then I'm going to cut short because I want questions, but this is something that we're getting really excited about these days. So we're using language models. Woohoo! And in this specific case, we're looking at given varying windows of previous utterances, how predictable is the utterance that you're listening to? The more predictable it is, the faster you should be. And here we see something very like the previous plot. In the matching game familiar interlocutor, both groups are affected by the complexity. The lower predictability, the more complex, the slower they are. And this effect is bigger for the autistic children. And the more predictable it is, the faster you are. The same for the questions. So the affiliative conversation with familiar interlocutors. But when we look at the affiliative conversation with an unfamiliar interlocutor, and here we change the axis to make it more visible, but really it's flat, right? So it is reliably negative like in the before ones, but the slope is very reliably flatter, right? So maybe this is very speculative, right? The cognitive load of speaking with a previously unknown person is sort of trumping the predictability of the utterances. Yes. We wanted to see whether these interacted with social and linguistic skills, but these are complex models. When we put them in, the estimates become so uncertain that we have no idea what's going on there. So what have we learned? Contrary to established wisdom, autistic children are faster in naturalistic conversations. Reviewers hate the word faster. They say, no, they're interrupting more. I'm just going to stick to faster because overlapping a bit is still a measure of speed and sync. In affiliative familiar context, this is due to increased overlappings. but not so in other contexts. They're really faster. And I'm thrilled to have students doing the qualitative coding. Individual differences versus the very rough age diagnosis analysis that were done before seem to matter in non-trivial ways, but we need more generalizable results. The results we have, they're good for publishing one study. They're really not good to get the broader picture. Turn-by-turn dynamics and environment matter. Predictability, the other tempo are very important to include. We have the methodological tools to deal with this stuff. Let's do that. And we should really stop conceptualizing the child, no matter whether autistic or typically developing, as this monad out there in the world, but we should model the dynamical system in which they engage. What is really dissatisfying in this line of research so far is that even if they're very fancy, even if they're in STAN, even if there's causal diagrams, it's regressions, regressions, regressions. And I'm gonna go away. And that's where sorry. And this is where we're doing a systematic review of the non-human animal literature, which is super, super cool, because as you're working with humans, you carry all your implicit assumptions about, of course, we're taking turns. Of course, a negative latency is a failure of interaction. Right? We need to sort of optimize the information transfer if you've never had a conversation in your life, right? But if you're studying animals, if you even try to say that, you're going to be crucified, right? In the non-human animal literature, you need to have a proposal of a model in which the coupling is effectively happening. And 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5 in some papers, null models in which the apparent coupling and adjustment might happen by whatever other chance mechanisms that you could see in the literature. And this is where it's super exciting. Of course, when they then find some coupling, they say, and this is just like in humans, because in humans, we know that it's just, no, stop it. Stick to the animals, non-human animals. So it's a huge enterprise because the words used across fields are very different. So we had to go through 8,000 papers, hits, and we found 34 articles with models. Doesn't really matter what the models are. The most prominent one are about periodic movements. We're implementing them, all of them in an R package, so you will all be able to use them, because then we can do really cool things, like instead of having leopard seals pop, in which 2 of the models have been tested, we can actually systematically test all the models across all the species, including humans. I have some extra slides if you're interested in that. But also, and here is where it becomes very interesting, just by reading these papers, my head starts boiling with new ideas, right? So for instance, if we look at the non-human animal literature, we can see that overlapping are very functional. They're used to confuse predators, right? If the other frog is a bit more loud in their vocalizations, then you might want to just vocalize exactly at the same time, because in case there is a predator, that's the frog that's going to be eaten. Or there's in pilot whales, that's a very fun study that we've done. Once a female pilot whale starts vocalizing during hunt, all the other pilot whales will start joining in, and they will keep vocalizing underwater, because that allows them speculatively to know where the others are. When a male pilot whale does start vocalizing, nobody cares, because they're sort of moved between pod and pod, so nobody knows how good they really are at hunting. But also, when we look at these non-human animal literature, what we have is that people are putting colors and detectors, and we see that there are very complex temporal scales of social interactions. They're not just on a turn-by-turn basis, but they happen over the course of hours, days, weeks. And the frequency at different time scales of these interactions matters for how well synchronized, for instance, the animals are. And that's something that we haven't really studied in humans, but as we get these linear recorders for days on, we might start having a grasp of that. And that doesn't matter. So final words. I thought I would do a small detour from my studies of content in conversations by taking these easy turn taking. And as usual, it's always turtles all the way down, right? It's a very complex and nuanced phenomenon. It's really rich, but it's timing, which means we can do very fancy modeling and test better hypotheses. Explicit evidence synthesis and critical cumulative building is crucial. I know every time we write a paper, me first, we think we're doing cumulative, we're building on the previous research, we're finding the gaps, but I think that we really need to do that much more explicitly. And DAGs are one way, they're not the only way, but I think it's a useful way. Critical because we don't want to be removing overlapping for the rest of our life, right? Changing things is also good. Doing good mechanistic science is hard. I really wanted to start by doing better modeling, and then I realized that I would have never published anything. It's okay to do one piece at a time. And also it's okay to put out pieces of the work and hope that somebody else will pick it up. And restating critical, cumulative, collective science is what we should all be doing. And with that, thank you and everybody who participated in the research. There's a chat. I know, yeah, who's, should I manage the, okay, you? Yes.
One's just a small thing. If you ask me a question and I go, and then answer it, does the count as me talking or not?
In the way, so at this stage, since we work with, so the Yukon corpus is about 400 hours of conversation, it counts because we use automated speaker diarization to identify when vocalizations are happening.
So if you said something and I go, or you're speaking, that counts as me interrupting you.
Exactly. In the Rush chop, since everything is transcribed and coded manually, because that's an hospital and they have so much resources available, what we can do is we can look at what people are actually saying, and we can remove the utterances in which that start with an interjection or a back channeling. And the effects are slightly smaller, but they're the same, like they don't change in direction.
My other question is, in the dyads, do you have any information about whether the adult is autistic also?
None of the adults are diagnosed with autism. We know that autism runs in families. So whether they also have autistic traits, we don't. But that's probably likely, yes.
It'd be interesting as well with like the unfamiliar person who came in later.
The unfamiliar person is not, well, it's an RA hired by the hospital. They are working in the autism field. So actually, I was going to say definitely not, but at least they definitely don't have a diagnosis. But they might have autistic traits. That's a good point. We don't know. It's always the same across all the children. The RA, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarification question that I mentioned is diagnosed with autism and then 0, 1, 2, 3 months. So when were they diagnosed actually? Because in Australia, I understand that it's not until they're 2, but they
Oh,
is autistic. So I just want to know what is the point of diagnosis?
yeah. So those were 0 months from first visit, meaning the first visit. Because the groups were linguistically matched, they had different ages, and that's a way of removing that interdependence between diagnosis and age. But what we have is that the average age of the typically developing children is 28 months. The average age of the autistic children is closer to 3 years of age. What happens in New England, where the data was collected, is that you can get diagnosed before 3 years of age, but if you get diagnosed before 3 years of age, you have to have your diagnosis reconfirmed after 2 years. and not everybody gets it reconfirmed. The children who are in the study, they all got it reconfirmed. Yeah. Yes.
So I was wondering about, assume that the answer to this is no, because you would have mentioned it if so, but I was wondering about sort of, if you had measures of processing speed more generally for well, any of the children, but in particular, I'm interested in this, because first of all, if you match them linguistic development, we know that processing speeds up as you get older, right?
Mhm.
And so much of the speed up of the autistic children is just because they're older, higher general processing speed for their linguistic development. And then I guess my other thing is, a related question is that we know that autism and ADHD are often very, very defined, and ADHD, one of the impulses, you're more impulsive.
Mhm.
And well, who knows why that is and what's going on there, but like, if you had any other cognitive measures of, cognitive. Yes.
These are excellent questions. I think that for the Yukon study, we might have some metadata on that. I need to go back and check, but we haven't checked. And this is an excellent point. For the ADHD, that's something that we've been discussing a lot, especially if we well, actually, I think both the conceptualization as interruption and as low threshold for predictability would be consistent. We don't have the data for the Yukon corpus. We only have reported comorbidity from the parents for the Roche-CHOP corpus. But at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, they've been collecting a much larger set of children with neurodevelopmental conditions in general. And they have been administering the brief, which also has an item about impulsivity. So we're going to be looking in that corpus as well. Because again, here, actually, that's something I should make very explicit. Here we have autism, and that's a terrible category. Right. Most of the clinical research is now agreeing on the fact that we have these networks of symptoms that often co-cause each other, creating bad and good feedback loops, and just using these categories that were developed to work in a necessarily bureaucratic welfare system or health system is not good for research, right? It's necessary to assign resources to people, but it's really bad for research. Yeah. But it's also hard because a lot of the more fine-grained tools have been developed within a diagnosis. And those that seem to be transdiagnostics so far, they're the subclinical ones. And when you have patients, they just go, everybody goes at ceiling, and it's not very informative. So I'm sure there are better tools out there. They're not commonly used, at least. Yeah.
Thanks again. Interesting. I just wanted to ask about the difference between those who are really good linguistically, but and are faster, and those who are really good at social interactions that are slow. So there's clearly an interaction there of some sort. And it seems like those who are good at social interactions have to potentially slow down, so inhibit their response. They want to say something, but they know that it's polite to not interrupt, or so there is this set of aspects. Whether there is a particular kind of way you can calculate the ability to inhibit the response, and equally whether this would also correlate with the linguistic ability and cognitive function. So whether the combination of the two factors could reveal something else about the speed of processing.
I think so. So right now, I've been trying to work as much as possible with data sets that were being collected for other purposes, just shaping the data collection because it's very convenient for me. But we need to actually start working at a more fine-grained level, yes. And I think, though, that before we do that, I want to do the qualitative coding because that's going to tell us something more about disinhibition, right? Yeah, but that's an excellent point, yeah.
Also noticing that they're getting faster over time, so perhaps this inhibition that you have goes down somewhere, and that's the well, they become probably more optimal at what is the good amount of waiting.
Yeah.
versus,
Also, what we see is that the number of overlappings doesn't change between groups and over time, or at least not reliably. What we see is that how early do you jump in, or alternatively, how much the other person keeps on talking. That's also the terrible thing and fantastic thing of working with naturalistic data, that we don't know whether it is actually an interruption or not. It needs to be qualitatively coded. And that's where psycholinguists often throw a lot of critiques at this, because what they do is they know what the sentence was. But in a conversation, it's harder. So I don't know when you speak, but when I speak, I don't always know where I'm going to end. So I'm open for, so even if the sentence is not concluded, I was open probably from the very start in an affiliative conversation, especially with a familiar interlocutor, to the other sort of jumping in whenever it's appropriate. But yes, so it's tricky, right? We need to look at impulse control. We need to look at where they're jumping in. We need to do more fine-grained cognitive profiling of or profiles of the children